Thanks. Yeah, so we want to talk about 3D GIS and how you can use that in the applications of flood risk and climate change. And I want to recognize, again, Jeff Taylor with Esri. This is a lot of this work that we're going to be showing in the next few minutes is some partnerships that the two of us have been doing together. So Reynolds and Jim did a great job at kind of showing why are we using 3D, how are we using 3D, and I'm going to hit on some of that again, and maybe more specifically again in the flood and climate change and sea level rise context. So the issue is, flood and hydrologic information can be really difficult to interpret, even for scientists, even for the engineers that are running the models. Certainly for GIS professionals, this is not necessarily easy data to interpret and understand. So if we're having trouble understanding it, imagine decision makers, your local elected officials, your city managers. How are they going to be able to take in this data and ascertain the information from it that they need? Also, we want to make data more easily accessible. Jim mentioned URL solution, and we'll talk about that again in a few minutes. The idea of just sending someone a link and 3D pops up on their screen. They don't have to download any third-party plugin. They don't have to download another program. That it's just there. And so that's another great advantage to solving this problem. So what we have found is that 3D GIS visualization, and it supports a lot of these needs. And like Jim, I've been doing GIS or 3D GIS for nearly 10 years. The whole ArcScene, ArcGlobe, SketchUp, Google Earth, and it's really come a long way in the past decade. But I would say that over the last couple of years, Esri has, with ArcGIS Pro, with ArcGIS Online, and WebScenes, the technology is really starting to take off, and the possibilities of things that we can do with it are increasing greatly. So, why 3D? Again, it brings 2D data to life. If nothing else, it's a great attention getter, right? It can start that conversation, and probably you all have experienced it one time or another. A lot of times that's half the battle, just starting that conversation. Again, if you're thinking about some of your local constituents, your city managers, your county managers, you want to have that conversation with them. You put a map on the left in front of them, and they're going to say, "Okay, I don't really understand that." But you put a 3D visualization like this in front of them, and they're likely to go, "Wow, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. How did you create that? I want to know more." So it's a great attention getter. We find that 3D is great for situational awareness, just helping folks become more familiar with the environment that they're working in. It's kind of that virtual way of becoming familiar with the environment that they're working in. Great for demonstrating proposed solutions or proposed actions. Just a good way to, people can say, "Oh, well, I recognize, that's my house, or that's my place of business, or that's an area that I'm interested in." It can allow them to do that. So again, there's a lot of 2D tools out there for thinking about issues such as sea level rise, flash flooding, coastal flooding, whatever you might be dealing with. There's a lot of good tools out there. A lot of these tools are really only focused with the horizontal extent of flooding, and certainly that's important. But we also want to understand the vertical extent of flooding, because just because your business or your home may flood, well, is it a few inches of water that's getting into that business, or is it a couple of feet of water that's getting into that structure? And that's a very different scenario in terms of your vulnerability and your exposure. So again, tools like this can help us answer those questions. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff for a few minutes. A lot of what you're seeing and what you saw in Jim's presentation is based on a lot of remote sensing, collecting data, generating 3D buildings, collecting LiDAR data, and doing cool stuff with that. So Jeff's going to talk about that for a few minutes.
Awesome. Hey guys, so for those of you that attended the session I had earlier, we talked about how to create 3D city models very quickly using your LiDAR, extract information, and other things. We're going to quickly recap on that here in a minute. Continue the risk presentation throughout that. So to begin with, what you saw box models. We've been doing that for about 20 years, right? Let's get into the complexity of this procedural modeling technology. Well, with Esri tools and capabilities that we've released, you're able to produce a 3D city model in a few hours or less than a day for large areas. And that's really what we're trying to help people to accomplish. Now, before, how long it would take to manually model a city in 3D? That's daunting. That's overwhelming. So the key is we wanted to try to make it to where anyone can be successful, creating a, slides are delayed, fast representation. Now, this procedural technology, why isn't it playing? There we go. To give you an example, if you're going to model a couple of buildings that are very iconic, maybe a specific tower downtown or a very complex custom building, you can do it by hand in the past, or you can still do it by hand. But if you're modeling massive areas, we've released the capability to procedurally model elements. That takes the time way down. As you see here, that's one procedural code with small modifications to attributes that can create all of those different styles of buildings, for example, or the ability to place trees in certain locations and have them generate immediately. So here's an example of starting to take a lot of this data in at once. So first of all, we can have point clouds that you have, for instance, from the state of North Carolina, or existing data. And we're going to be releasing tools soon that allow you to color those point clouds with your ortho RGB values. So it allows you to actually visualize that a little more realistically. That's one way of having a 3D city model, right? But there is not really as much intelligence to this. So we have to then start to make more meanings. We have to start to classify the information. And what you're seeing is the ability to stream this classified LiDAR in the cloud afterwards in this data and show it this way too. But we have tools for doing this, and I think North Carolina stuff already is classified fairly well to where you can start to show this as well this way. But then we can also leverage some solutions and tools that we've released to create procedural 3D building models so you have an asset inventory. So then you know exactly what's going to be impacted for vulnerability purposes. And then your vegetation as a visual. Now, if we take it a little step further, we can start to look at point data. Maybe we've highlighted some problems. In this case, that would be capital improvements. Or we can start to visualize vulnerability in that third dimension. And we can look at our critical assets as well and understand between the two what's going to be affected. So with that being said, to really kick off talking about vulnerability, I want to hand back off to Greg. You can really dive into that further.
Sure. Well, first of all, why are we talking about flooding? Why are we talking about climate change, sea level rise? Well, it's a major issue, and we've had some pretty historic recent events just last year or over the last couple of years in South Carolina and Texas. And flooding is actually the leading cause of deaths from all natural disasters in the U.S. Over 200 people a year in the U.S. die from in flood-related events. And it's not just big storms. I mean, we think about hurricanes and storm surge, and we think about flash flooding events and heavy precipitation, prolonged heavy precipitation that leads to massive flooding. But it's also what we call nuisance flooding events, too, tidal flooding, for instance. And folks along the coast are really familiar with this. Down in Miami, Charleston, South Carolina, these flooding events are happening every time we have a high tide. And then when you get the king tides in the springs and the fall, this is really exasperated. So these flooding events, they're on the increase. And so that's why, we're thinking about how to use tools such as 3D GIS to address some of those issues. So you've heard us talking a lot about 3D visualization. What are the key parts that go into that? Hopefully by now you're thinking, I'd like to go back and maybe try this. What do I need? How do I get started? So first of all, you got to have good elevation data. And fortunately in North Carolina, we have that, good LiDAR elevation data, good resolution. We need good imagery. We've also got that in North Carolina statewide. Then you need other key infrastructure, such as buildings. We want to, basically we want 3D buildings and maybe vegetation. We're showing tree canopies and vegetation types. So that kind of allows us to, we've got the elevation, the imagery. We put what it is we're interested in assessing on top of that, buildings, maybe vegetation. And then we need some kind of overlay of interest, flooding scenario, some kind of flood model. Again, it could be a sea level rise model. It could be a hydro model from an engineering firm. We could look at population vulnerability. I mean, essentially any kind of overlay data set we can put in there to create the visualization. And this really starts to talk about the levels of detail, especially when we think about our 3D buildings. How detailed of a 3D building are we going to generate?
There's several different levels of detail. This is a very, very important concept to understand. We can do a 3D extrusion over the past 20 years or more. Since 3D was first invented. If you guys remember Tron, that's where that first started, right? Going from there, now with procedural rules, we can very easily obtain LE2 slightly under level 3% of the buildings in the city. Now, as you're talking about some tools that allow you to produce more accurate models, just see a sneak peek of an earlier iteration of that tool, Greg will show in a minute, for LOD3 buildings, you can also use photography buildings like Raleigh has done, or other models to get to this level. And then level detail 4 is the ultimate area. 24, all these other shows, movie companies have been showing, hey, let's go on the fly inside the building, emergency management, look at what's there. Let's look at the risk associated with sending officers in here or something. Well, we really don't have those capabilities yet for most clients on the network. That's that next dimension. That's going to be the next driving force after what you're seeing.
Yeah. And so just to expand on that a little bit and give you an example of what some of these different options look like. And again, you're thinking about, well, how do I get started? Well, if we at least have 2D building footprints, and we've got 2D building footprints, the state has them for every structure in the state. There is a 2D building footprint. A lot of you counties and cities maintain your own separate data sets, but we do have that data available. So if you at least have 2D building footprints, we can bring that into 3D. We can extrude those to some sort of estimated height. You know, if it's residential buildings, you might give it one height. If it's a commercial building, another height. You could pull some of that information from the tax data. Very rudimentary. I mean, this was kind of, the state of the 3D, 6, 8, 10 years ago, but we're moving away from that. Another option would be to generate your building models procedurally. So using a tool like City Engine that Reynolds and Jim mentioned in the previous presentations. We can take those building footprints and just sort of randomize them a little bit. So, we could put random roof forms on top of them, and it may not accurately represent or precisely represent exactly what that roof form looks like, but at least it gives you a bit of a general feel for what that area may look like. We could even put random facades onto the sides of these buildings. There's different ways, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, we can get facades onto the sides of buildings. We could use SketchUp. As a manual way, go out and take pictures of all the buildings. But if you're thinking about doing this citywide, that's really not a good solution. Then using the LiDAR data that we keep talking about, we could also generate buildings procedurally using the LiDAR data and start to get at more precise roof forms so that the buildings start to more accurately represent what the building should represent. And there's some different ways we can use the LiDAR data to do that. We can do direct feature extraction that Jeff was just talking about. You can go directly from LiDAR points to a 3D building model. And this is all based on the accuracy and the resolution of the LiDAR data, the post-density spacing of the LiDAR data, but that capability does exist now. Another way is using stereo imagery. So a lot of communities have flown at one point or another stereo imagery. And so there's some digital imaging techniques that you can use to generate really detailed 3D building models from the stereo imagery. And then finally, to get those photo facades, you could use a solution from pictometry, for example. And Jim mentioned the product that they have for the city of Raleigh, using the oblique imagery, the 45-degree angle imagery. There's calculations that can be done to generate a pretty detailed 3D building model from that. So then it really gets down to a question of, okay, well, what data do I have? What's the cost associated with each of these? The level of effort that's going to be required to generate these. And again, ultimately, what is the user going to need? What's the decision that you're wanting to answer? On the left, just working with the LiDAR data, which is going to be a lower cost solution. Is that going to be sufficient to highlight, again, this theme of sea level rise versus going to a more full solution with the oblique imagery on the sides of those buildings? And again, it's really just the decision that you're having to make. But now you're starting to get the idea. You can see, okay, of the buildings, well, here's some water level heights. And if you are talking about photo facades, you can see, well, okay, there's a water level that's halfway up the front door of that building or the garage door of that building, starts to become a little more impactful and meaningful. And we can really start to expand on these 3D visualizations. We can pull in vegetation, we can pull in overhead utilities, we can pull in other infrastructure, bridges, roadways, and create really a complete scene, if you will. But there's other analysis that we can do, and Jim mentioned this several times, and I really like the way you talk about the shiny object, because really, this is cool. This is a shiny object. This has some application. Again, we could put this in front of a neighborhood association meeting, and okay, well, where are my buildings being impacted? This is all representing, by the way, some work we're doing down in Fort Lauderdale in South Florida. But now we can start to do additional analysis as well, and really the business proposition of how are we actually using this data to help from a planning standpoint or community visualization standpoint. So what we're doing here is these 3D buildings, we've taken the photo facades off of them, and we're just color coding them based on their risk to sea level rise, or their exposure to sea level rise. So if we were to overlay a 1 foot sea level rise scenario, if we're to overlay really all the sea level rise scenarios, which buildings are going to be more or less impacted from that? So you can see the buildings that are color coded in the darker red, indicating that they're going to be impacted immediately by just a 1 or 2 foot rise in sea level, whereas the lighter color buildings, it's going to take a 4 or 5 foot rise in sea level rise before those buildings are impacted. And again, it's not just necessarily the yes/no question: is this building impacted? Yes, no, but maybe the percentage of that building that's impacted. So we can do the same thing here. We're assuming I think a 3 foot sea level rise. And we're asking the question, okay, well, how much of that building is being impacted? And then what we've done is color-coded the roofs, again, on a color, darker red, indicating that a higher percentage of that building is impacted, and the lighter colors indicated that a lower percentage of that building is impacted. We're doing some work in other South Florida communities. This is Brevard County, Melbourne, Kennedy Space Center area, where we've done a very similar set of analyses. We're also looking at storm surge. Again, it's another flood overlay layer that we can integrate, so we can bring in storm surge and do those same sorts of analyses and calculations as well. And again, we're thinking about this at a more of a citywide or a county-wide perspective. Backing out, maybe not focusing so much on these iconic buildings or focusing so much on the water level rise on an individual building, but how do we think about this, for an entire area? I was going to let Jeff talk about 3D building slicing.
Taking to the next level, we want to know one thing: how much of the floor of the building, the ground floor, is going to be affected, which honestly tells us whether or not we have an economic issue to deal with. And if that anything touches it, usually we have a problem, but if it's a large portion of the building, we will have trouble. We also want to know how much of the building is affected in a way that we can't retrofit the building. And we have the ability to basically slice floor information. In this case, we're coming to the concept of inundation area ratio. We want to take the ratio of the total square footage of the building in relation to what's actually being impacted. In some cases, we can retrofit the basements in a way that will be more resilient. In other ways, very slow. So this is a quick video example. So this is a physical website. We saw it earlier briefly. In this case, we've done the same thing for we showed in Indigo. We're taking in other sea level rise radios to visually show this impact as you go. Now, we're working with EMAC to basically do this for geometry-based applications. So it's a little more interactive. But this just shows you alone at 3 feet or 4 feet, which this could happen with a really, really terrible storm. You can get the water moving up. You're going to have a lot of features. In fact, in this case, this is a Mercy hospital. And to give an idea, this is a very, very critical piece of infrastructure right now. And in fact, rising water is exactly what it can cause. They've got to evacuate from the hospital. A lot of people that get in a lot of trouble if something may happen. So it allows us to move forward, mitigate problems, attempt to help the problem before they happen.
Yeah, and the other key message with this too is that this introduces the idea of the web scene, the URL that Jim mentioned previously. So, up until a couple of years ago, we could create all these great 3D visualizations, on our desktop, but there really wasn't a good way to share that information or disseminate that information other than just creating some screenshots, some 2D graphics, and sending those to folks. But now, with the invent of web scenes and being able to publish all this information directly from ArcGIS Pro right into ArcGIS Online and create web scenes, we can actually send someone a link to this, and it's there, and you can begin to interact with it. So that's really that to me has been kind of one of the biggest advancements in the technology over the last couple of years is that now we can easily disseminate this information with others. And anybody can make it. So I just want to wrap up with a quick story here, just to again kind of show this concept. And so in 2004, we had some pretty significant flooding up in Asheville, and this is showing you a U-Haul business that's located pretty close to a major river there in Asheville, but close yet not right on the river, across the road and slightly elevated, not too much, but when the forecast for heavy rainfall and the potential for flooding came in, the business owner here had a decision to make. Do I need to relocate all of my trucks and trailers or not worry about it? Obviously, as you can tell, he chose not to worry about it. Well, maybe he didn't have all the information that he needed. And so if we go back again to this, looking at 2D information, we've got good data, on where are our commercial buildings, where are our floodplains, where do those intersect, and then we can start to, maybe apply some vulnerability to that and identify which parcels or which buildings are more vulnerable to a potential flooding scenario in that case. And we can share that information, but again, it's not always conveyed the way you would like it to be. And so if we go back to this idea of using a tool like this, like a web scene, and show that same information in 3D, and now you can see, this location here where the U-Haul facility is. Yeah, that's definitely going to be flooded. I need to think about moving my assets out of the way so that I am not impacted in that event. And so that's really, the message that we're trying to get across here is that, taking this traditional 2D data, presenting it, and disseminating it in ways that hopefully people can make better use of. Will help folks hopefully be better prepared for flood risk and climate change situations. So we'll just kind of wrap up here. Some things that we're still working on, constantly better integration of 3D GIS for flood modeling, for sea level rise scenarios. We talked about this impact area ratio where we're doing, analyzing the area affected of buildings. So we're working on trying to automate some of that process. Seeing how we can apply this more to risk and resiliency planning. And of course, we're always doing training and trying to work with other collaborators and other partners to help them do the same. I know Esri will speak about any last things, looking at existing conditions, modeling, geodesign.
It's not just limited. Once you figure out where your vulnerabilities are, problems. The next thing is to delve into the geodesign process and mitigate this. You have intelligent geospatial data. And for the first time, we're actually able to really integrate that in the design process more heavily and make more informed and resilient decisions for the next generations.
Yeah. And with that, we'll entertain a few questions. Yeah, so the question is, are there hardware requirements or limitations to doing this? And Yeah, certainly ArcGIS Pro, with being 64-bit processing, that really, increases the functionality. Always having the best graphics card possible is, you always want to go for that.
Probably 2 gigs or better.
Yeah.
An NVIDIA type card, if you can.
Yeah.
Most other companies have dropped the other graphics drivers that are not NVIDIA. The other things you want to keep in mind is if you can do a 2 gig or larger size OpenGL graphics card, that's good. You can set Pro to immediately support that. As far as RAM, you want at least 16 gigabytes of RAM. Most of the larger 3D software, 3D Studio Max, other companies also require a higher amount of RAM on your machine now. And other than that, just have a good quad-core machine at least that you can run it on and you're good to go.
Yeah. Okay.